Hi class, welcome to this lecture. This is called The Complexity of Line. So today, as you'll note in your textbook, the first chapter that is due for this week is a chapter completely on line. So we'll go through the kind of the complexity of line, and it probably seems like line is pretty, pretty easy to understand. You see lines every day, you know what a line is, but I hope to kind of expand on your definition of line here and really present it as being much more complex than we might initially think. But as always, I wanted to start with a little outline. So reminder that because I wanted to give y'all extra time to get the textbook, I've put the deadline for the material for week 1 as well as week 2 until this Friday. Or I'm sorry, this Sunday. This is the online class, so that's a typo. So make sure you know that that is not due until Sunday night, but make sure you do it by Sunday night. Again, I do have the 48-hour late policy. In other words, if it's 1 day late, I'll take off 1 point off that quiz and the discussion, and if it's two days late, I'll take off 2 points from the quiz and or discussion, and then after 48 hours, you'll just receive a 0. So be sure to get those things done. If you still don't have the textbook, email me and let me know. Give me a receipt that says you bought it or something like that, and I can extend those deadlines for you. All right, the second thing I wanted to remember to tell you was to give you a reminder about terms. So as you start to read your textbook and as you begin to watch and listen to these lectures, make sure you're writing down important terms that come up throughout the lectures and within the book. And your book is really nice because it even offers bold terms. And so you can really kind of pick out what's the important terms are. So make sure that you're writing those down as you prepare. Writing down these terms and knowing how to use them in a sentence will be helpful as you prepare to write that middle of the semester paper that will be due right before spring break, and that's going to be a compare and contrast. And then the second lecture that I will post this week will be a visual analysis. So that'll kind of help you to prepare. It'll be kind of like a practice for that paper, which will be coming soon. And then this week's discussion will also be practice for you. So this week's discussion asks you to do a visual analysis on a piece that I've selected. So make sure you do that later in the week and let me know if you have questions. But getting to the learning objectives for today. So we're going to distinguish among line, contour, and implied line. These are 3 different types of line. And then we're going to describe the different qualities that lines possess. So what is a line? You're probably thinking to yourself, well, I know what a line is. Basically, a line possesses the qualities of direction, division, thickness, and patterns of movement. And line is something that we see all over in elements of nature. It's all around us. So as you look around yourself right now, you probably see loads of different types of lines just in your everyday surroundings, right? Water flows in lines along the landscapes. You can see that certainly line happens in nature. Line also defines the limits of land and borders, etc. And power is absolutely inherent in lines. So we'll look at a few paintings today where we see power happening through sets of lines. And so these might be real lines, but they're often implied lines. And we'll talk about that in just a second too. But we see how power can be inherent in lines because certain lines can evoke order and certain lines can evoke chaos. But we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So the things I'm going to show you today, the images I'm going to show you are for the most part from your book. So if you did the readings, hopefully this is some of this will be a recap, but then I'm also going to supplement the book by adding a lot of my own kind of imagery and broadening the scope of the things that happen in your book. But I wanted to start with outline, and I thought this this piece by Nara was a very important kind of way to show you outline as a term itself. So outline indicates the shape of a 2- or 3-dimensional form and emphasizes its flatness. So this is really important. The flatness of line is an outline. The flatness of a shape that's been outlined, right, this is an outline. So notice how all of the color is very flat and the figure has simply been outlined in this piece. Okay, so this is in contrast to contour lines. Contour lines in contrast, form the edge of a 3-dimensional shape and suggest volume, recession, or projection in space. So here we have Ellsworth Kelly, who creates the illusion of leaves. And how would this be different from outline? So remember that outline emphasizes flatness, But here you have the emphasis of three-dimensionality, right? And so we have volume that is suggested, and we see that through the curves of the lines that are used to represent the leaves that seem to fold in certain ways. They seem to be recessing in certain areas and projected in certain areas. So this is the kind of the big difference between just a simple outline, which we see here, and the contour lines that we see here. Now, these are two other really important terms. So we have two different types of line that we often see within paintings and imagery. So the first is implied line, and this is when we see a continuous mark which connects one point to another, but the connection is visually suggested. So we don't actually see a real line here, like a contour or an outline, but rather a line that's just implied by whatever is being suggested within the painting. So here, if I were to ask you, I'd ask you, where are the implied lines here? Hopefully you would say, right here with the clouds and the cherubs, they kind of form a line which divides the painting into two parts. But then you also look up and you see there's almost a line suggested here as well by the figures at top. God at the center and then two angels who flank him. So really you'd say there are two different areas here where we see the implied line. One is here and then the other is right here. Okay. We also have the use of line of sight. Now this is very common within artworks as a way to move the viewer's eye around the painting. So here we have the direction in which figures are looking. This serves as an important compositional function, an important compositional tool. So here, if you look to the Virgin Mary at center, her eyes look directly up, right? And so our eyes follow her eyes in this line of sight to look up to God. But even below her, we see there's a mass crowd of people whose eyes look up as well. And so if we were to start here by looking at the bottom of the painting, we also have kind of some implied lines created through the gestures of the figures, so that as the figures reach their hands up to the sky, our eyes follow their eyes and their gestures up to the Virgin Mary. And of course, she raises her hands as well and gazes up towards God. And so we have this type of line of sight aiding us through the painting, moving us from the bottom of the painting up to the top of the painting. And this can be kind of a helpful kind of graph on top of the painting to show you what I mean. So here we have the dotted lines showing the implied line within the piece, dividing the painting into three separate parts. And then we have the line of sight, drawing our eye from down here, from these people, to the Virgin, the Mother of God, and then as she looks up, she looks right to Christ as well, and he looks back down, okay? So there's kind of this kind of play between the visual gaze of the people within the painting. And now, I'll let you take a look at this for just a second, and I want to ask you this question. Where do you see any implied lines here, or any lines of sight? Think about if you can pick a few out. Okay. So hopefully you thought to yourself that there are a few things happening here. Line of sight is absolutely implied here. You see a lot of the people look at the center, to the center and up towards Christ on the the crucified Christ. Okay, so that's where we're having the line of sight is from these people to the center and up. We also have implied lines, which are emphasized by this kind of light source at the center top of the piece, which come down. Okay, so our eye is drawn here all the way down to the Christ, the figure of Christ at center. So we also have very expressive qualities of line as well. Vincent van Gogh is one of these artists who really employs expressive lines in his painting The Starry Night. Hopefully this is a piece that's already part of your visual vocabulary. It's become a part of pop culture. Many people know about Van Gogh. In my class, I always ask, what do you guys know about Van Gogh? And someone always says, wasn't he crazy? So it's kind of funny, and I'm sure that those of you who know about him, you might think the same thing. So yes, he was actually in a mental institution when he painted this, right? He was in his room looking out a small window at the city and was inspired and painted this at that point in his life. But when we talk about lines, the thick lines he uses here, yes, you can see definitely implied lines here by the use of kind of expressive, thick brush strokes throughout the night sky, which seem to kind of imply lines of the wind or a movement of the air of some sort, but really you don't see any lines of sight here. There's no human, so you can't really have any lines of sight. It's important to note that he created this kind of thick use of expressive lines through the use of impasto, and this is a really thick application of paint, which absolutely contributes to the expressive quality of the line. And it's well known that prior to the creation of this work, Van Gogh created over 500 works and letters that exhibit his interest in this expressive energy that he sought to release through his work. So he was very much interested in expressiveness of line, and you see that throughout his body of work. So if you're curious, I encourage you to look at a few other pieces of him, and you'll see this type of line very often. Also, when we're talking about line, there's also much more controlled line that artists often use. So Alouette is one of these artists who's working much more contemporarily. He's working in the 90s and earlier as well. And as you can see, this line is controlled, it's logical, it's organized, in great contrast to Van Gogh's style. But yet these are still expressive lines, right? Even though they're more controlled. Works, one important thing to think about in terms of Alouette's work is that works are often generated by museum staff. So if a museum owns a Alouette piece, they own the instructions to the piece. So this might be difficult to comprehend, but to break it down for you, basically if a piece wants to exhibit one of his works, or if a gallery wants to exhibit one of his works, they basically get a set of instructions from the artist. And this is a thing that kind of happens in the 80s and 90s when we see artists, well actually in the 70s as well, we see artists starting to think more of art as an idea that can be constructed by anyone. But the idea is the artist's. So Alouette creates this idea for this work, and he creates a set of instructions that he then sends to the gallery. And the gallery workers come together and they put the piece together themselves. So the artist's hand is actually moving farther and farther away from the actual work. And this is an interesting transition that we see happening, again, as I said, kind of starting in the 70s, but all the way through the present. So because of this, each work will be unique because he gives very specific instructions, but each space will kind of interpret the instructions in different ways. Here's an example of Alouette actually attending a gallery and him working with one of the gallery workers or curators. So this is a very common thing that we see happening. But here you really see his use of line, right? There's order, no chaos at all, right? Much less expressive in certain ways, but you still see his real emphasis on line and color. Another important artist when we think about line is Bridget Riley. She's an artist from the op art movement, and I'm sure as you're looking at the screen right now, you're starting to get a headache. And that is what's supposed to happen. This is optical art, right? It's op art, and so there's the illusion of movement, and there's an optical illusion here with the work. So you almost seem to think that the image itself is moving, but it's just the movement of the line and the way that the line is thicker and thinner in certain spots on the canvas that creates this optical illusion. And the same goes for this piece. Okay, this is from 1964. And again, there's nothing really happening here with the computer screen. It's actually just an illusion that you, as you gaze into the center, I encourage you to gaze right into that center and kind of realize how your eyes interact with how you see the image on the page. It's likely that you'll start to kind of feel as though the circles are moving in opposite directions as you look at them. And for some people, this will give you a headache. So I won't show you this for too long, but I wanted to note the way in which line can be used in these very specific ways that are employed by Bridget Riley to create the illusion of movement within the piece. We also have the grid. When we talk about line, it's important to bring up the grid. The grid is basically a pattern of vertical and horizontal lines crossing one another, and this oftentimes will lend to a sense of unity within the composition. So here we have Pat Steyer, who bases her painting on the series by Bruegel, And it's part of what she would call, and what many artists actually use within their pieces, as vanitas. So a vanitas painting is basically a reminder about the transience of the material world and of everything in it, right, including us, human beings. And we'll see that often, and we'll talk about that more over the rest of the course. But here you see she's specifically referencing art historical works. So she's looking to Jean Bruegel the Elder, who created this flowers in a blue vase in 1599, and she's working more contemporarily in the 80s and referencing this piece, but putting her own twist on it, making it into a grid, and actually referencing the whole of art history. So each one of these little images within the grid is actually an image she's taken from art history, right, from different painters throughout the course of art. So she's really referencing the history of art and then creating her own kind of painting. And this is very common, that artists will always reference artists before them. But what does the grid do? Well, it makes it orderly. Otherwise, we'd have kind of absolute disorder here with all the variety of different flowers, different styles that we see within each square on the grid. But here it becomes orderly because of the grid. The grid can also be a little more broad. Carl Andre is one of these artists working in the 60s who was interested in the grid as well. But here he's placed the grid on the floor. This is called 64 square aluminum, and as you might assume, it's 64 squares of aluminum that have been placed on the floor. There's no adhesive, so they're not stuck to one another. And the artist asks you to walk over them. So you are interacting with the piece as you walk over it. The sound of the piece, you can hear yourself walking on aluminum as the pieces of aluminum move as you walk over them. And there's also kind of the echo of this sound throughout a gallery space. So here we see artists becoming more interested in engagement of visitors to museums. Expressive qualities of lines continued. Here we have Hung Lee, and she's an artist who is also interested in line, but here you see the drippings. These are the lines that she's really interested in. So how do you, what do those drippings do? Well, for her, they kind of function as markers of the process of painting for her. So here you can see at the top, it's actually kind of a photorealistic rendering of a woman, but as the painter paints, she often will let the paint drip down with each layer. So this is full of layers, and with each one, she decides to not clean up the drips. And she uses a very kind of thin kind of paint, oil paint used with thinner, like turpentine or something like that, and allowing those drips to kind of show us the process of painting, the different kind of layers that would be underneath the woman here. Same goes for this piece as well. Again, you see the drippings, which actually draw attention to the process of art making. And here we have an artist who's kind of dealing with line in a different way. So this is Gu Wenda, and he is an artist who uses a variety of line in his work, but it's much different than what we've looked at. And he actually usually creates these installation spaces, as you see here. So in other words, a space where you enter into, it's an environment. So the art surrounds you. And he uses text, as you can see here on the walls, but none of it is actually audible or readable. It's actually his own kind of language that he's made up based on Arabic, Chinese, English, and Hindi. And he's kind of made his own language up to comment on the way that we never actually, how much can we actually ever understand one another. In some ways. And to think more about this, and oh, one other thing I want to mention is that all of these lines here that he makes up the text with are all made of human hair. So he collects human hair as he moves around the continent, and then puts it into these pieces here. And one thing I wanted you to do as part of this week's lecture is to watch a short video on Gu Wenda. I posted it right above the link to this lecture, and it's very short. It's only like 5 or 7 minutes long, but what I really like about it is that it actually shows you the process that the gallery workers and curators go through when they get a piece like this and when they have to exhibit a piece like this. So go ahead and watch that and make sure that you take a second to do that. Line orientation. And so another important thing that we see within a lot of paintings are really strong horizontal and vertical linear compositions. And these often create a sense of rational control. So you look for mathematical parallels within the piece, perpendiculars, and this is the type of thing that will create order. We would see this piece here by Jacques-Louis David as very orderly, right? And what do we see here? Well, just to kind of jog your memory, we have implied line, but we also have line of sight, and then we also have kind of these perpendiculars and parallels within the piece. So here we probably look first to Socrates, who's kind of the brightest figure, so obviously our eye kind of turns to him first. He points his finger up, his gaze goes this way, this guy points his hand up, and then we can follow this line, which is kind of a perpendicular line, which is basically also a implied line, right, over to this part of the painting. And then here we kind of move through this space, this recession here, and our eye comes right to these figures way in the background. So this is kind of how artists are using orderly lines within their composition, not only to suggest order, but to make it so that they control the ways in which viewers view their works. Eugene Dulac is another artist, a French artist, who does something a little bit different, right? He's not interested in that order. In fact, he's interested in the opposite. Here he's trying to get at the theme of chaos. So we have an ancient story of this king of Sardanapalus, and he's trying to represent this story of when the king's his empire was being overthrown, and he was a complete narcissist. And he said, well, everything in my kingdom should be destroyed then. If I'm going to go down, I want everybody else to go down with me. So all of his jewels, everything he owns is being destroyed here. The women are being killed as he sits here waiting for his demise, right? And then there's a sense of chaos. We don't see any lines of sight or even really implied lines at all. The lines go every which way, and we're not able to kind of find an order within the piece, and that's specific to what Delacroix wanted. He wanted this piece to look chaotic, and so that's kind of what we get within the line as well. And you even see that within his preliminary drawings. This is his preliminary drawing, and just look at the use of the gestural lines, which then become kind of gestural lines within the painted surface itself. Richard Serra is another artist who's important to look at when we talk about line. So his lines are a little bit different, right? These are kind of public lines in really unique, kind of cool ways. So here we have the tilted arch. It no longer exists because it was actually a bit controversial when it was put up. And it was destroyed by 1989 because it's put up in the Federal Plaza in New York City at the time, and people thought it got too much in the way of their everyday busy lives. So there's a huge controversy around it at the time. I'm not going to go into it here, but this is just one way that we see these kind of huge lines on a mass scale that are used in public by artists. And Richard Serra, again, is one of these artists who creates these gigantic pieces. Right here we have a giant kind of steel piece. And here again we see the artist exporting his work to a steel factory or a steel mill, right? Where he gives them instructions and says, I want this piece to be this high, connected here and here and here, curving here and here. And it's his idea that counts, right? He had the idea for this giant piece, even though it will actually be the workers at the steel mill and the steel factory who will put it together for him. And the last thing I wanted to talk today was a different kind of line. Here, if anyone recognizes this, is Keith Haring. He was a graffiti artist before he became kind of a pop culture icon for street art, and also became known as kind of a high art artist as well. And he's known for his outlines of figures here. You've probably seen his work around, or a lot of people will reference it anyway. And And the important thing to note about Keith Haring is he's using outlines here, right? These are not contours because they don't suggest a three-dimensional space. Rather, you'll always see that his works are two-dimensional. We've always got flat color on flat color. Here you have the flat green over the flat pink, over the flat yellow with red dots, okay? His pieces are often very politically active, right? Politically conscious as well. So he was really active in the AIDS the AIDS movement in the 80s and 90s, which was important for him because he was a gay man. He actually died of AIDS when he was pretty young, but at the time he was part of the movement to visualize kind of the struggle for people with AIDS. I also like to talk about him because he was also interested in line and movement. So his designs, like I said, became pop culture kind of icons, and everybody loved his work. Everybody wanted his work, right? And so you see here he's got his a car, a BMW that was painted with his work and sold. And he was also interested in performance. So there's a number of performances where he painted the performers, and then they would do these amazing dances.